What happens when you mix dark fantasy, horror, sci-fi, and anime? Most would assume a grotesque abomination with 3 legs or something. However, in this timeline, we ended up with Vampire Hunter D. One of the greats, one of the classics, a film from 1985 that pushed the boundaries of Western comfort during a time when anime was just beginning to bud stateside. Set in a post-apocalyptic wasteland controlled not by radiation-free robots, but rather demons and Lord Vampirs, this movie takes us to a place truly unique amongst the fantastic and phantasmos. Our hero D, the Dhampir, is a half-vampire bounty hunter with a grudge against the demonic. A man whose powers are as many and varied as his past is steeped in mystery. Most of Vampire Hunter's lore is contained in novels rather than manga, which is unusual, but it certainly makes for an interesting movie. Not all vampires are inherently bad. Edward Cullen wasn't even that cringe. However, our view of the greater nobility steers us to think vampires are pretty bad. Back in the days of the mysterious sacred ancestor, things were different. But in the thousands of years since, the vampire nobility has taken their immortality as an everlasting duty to crush those beneath them, human and monster alike. Count Magnus Lee is the embodiment of this, a vampire of the greater nobility whose power is unrivaled. A man who's quite keen with the ladies and thinks with his teeth. A gloriously rugged-faced vampire who puts every gilf I've ever admired to shame. Look at that jawline and those lips. Oh, and those eyes, they're looking straight into my human soul. And those powers. Oh, I wonder what else he could do with those powers. This definitely evil vampire with no noticeable sexy appeal at all is the plot-driving antagonist for the 1985 film Vampire Hunter D. As always, there is more to the gore than a horrific romp through a fantastically contrived setting. Immortality! Thousands of years of struggling through life. The world and history are compounded not within Count Magnus, but rather within D. So catcall the gilf across the street and chop off your talking left hand, which is trying to give you a different perspective on life, and prepare yourself. 'Cause it's October, baby! The month of spooks, ghouls, and ghosties. A time for fear and dread as the mortal and ethereal planes begin to merge as the 31st rolls ever closer. Welcome to Bonsai Pop's Hellmouth! This is Vampire Hunter D, 1985. The story you never knew. Hi everyone, I'm Grant. This October, we're covering classic horror and dark fantasy anime here on Bonsai Pop in celebration of Halloween. The spook is here, so each week we'll have a new episode on some of your favorites. And every week we're having a viewing party on Patreon of what we're covering, so check it out. Now, enjoy some Deep D. Vampire Hunter D opens on this geometrically challenged castle. The architect who designed this had brain parasites, fun fact. I don't know how you're supposed to traverse around this place. I guess if you can turn into a bat and fly around, it's not as big of a deal. Just seems like a hassle. It's whatever. Then, we quickly cut to an upskirt shot of one Doris Lang. Classic and classy. She stalks prey with a large laser gun and cross pendant. A cross which, of course, is used to keep the blood-sucking vampires away. After the girl kills herself, a monster in a shower of gore, a werewolf kills her beloved/biblically named horse Luke and rips off her protective pendant only to run away, leaving her in the hands of the dreaded Count Magnus Lee. An intimidating vampire not just because of the lightning flashing behind him, but also because he seems to be 10 feet tall. Phantasms, he's only 6'3". Ryan the White Boy anime pleb has 5 inches on him. The Count bites the cutie/daughter of a werewolf hunter, setting our plot in motion. Then she bumps into this mysterious guy named D. You know why he's named D. Doris attacks D, who brushes it off like a Nerf gun bullet fired from your hot sister. And Doris is impressed, so she hires him to kill the gilf. I think it's important to note the significance of the vampire and its role in Hunter D. There are few monsters as universal as the blood-sucking undead known to us in the States as the vampire. Almost every culture in every corner of the world has its own version. From China to Native America, and from Russia to Africa, the vampire persists in many forms. It seems to me that there is a universal human ideology that brings the vampire to life in the human imagination. A longing for lost loved ones, a lack of understanding of the great beyonds, a fear of aging and dying. There is so much emotion tied to the concept of a vampire. The concept of living forever on the life force of others. Staying young forever isn't just idle ideation. It's something that we can see in royalty as well as the Hollywood elite. Being taken care of, owning things built from the blood and tears of low-class workers. This is something that persists to this day. It is demonic in its own way. Indeed, vampires of IRL folklore are known to have a demonic disposition, whereas humans are more considered good-natured. But D is a dhampir, a real-world monster contrived in the Balkans that made its way into Japanese light novels and some dope 80s movies. Dhampirs are said to be born of a male vampire and human woman. People considered dhampirs would often become vampire hunters. However, to live forever from a force of evil while maintaining the conscience that makes us human is purgatory, to say the least. Doris brings Dee back to her home where he meets her 8-year-old brother, Dan. A boy either wise beyond his years or really good at regurgitating other people's views on the world. Either way, Dan takes a liking to Dee, but quickly realizes,
I guess you're the kind who doesn't talk a whole lot, right, mister?
Dan goes on to do my job for me and analyze Dee, stating that there are two types of quiet people. The kind who stay quiet because they are thinking bad things, and the kind who has seen a lot of bad things and don't want to talk about them more than they have to. And he says that Dee is probably more of the second type of guy. An astute observation by the smartest 8-year-old I've ever seen. Tough times equals tough minds, I suppose. Our gorgeous, silent hero doesn't talk much, but when he does, it's always for a reason. He seeks out the nobility and takes jobs that demand he kill them in an effort to combat their wrongdoings. Dee is a hunter, and by now you know he's also a dhampir, a hybrid of a human and a noble vampire, often referred to as the nobility in this franchise. The nobility lived long before human history and were formed by a male vampire known as the Sacred Ancestor, or the Vampire King, or Count Dracula, or Count von Count. The Sacred Ancestor is more like a force of nature than a vampire. His mere presence is described as being darker than a black hole and can crush a person's psyche. He is a being that possesses the density of infinitely compacted darkness. He is able to summon large storms to blot out the sun, teleport vast distances, annihilate an entire castle, and he once created a hole a few miles wide in circumference and over a mile deep with a wave of his cape. At least, that's what I gathered from my arcane research. I don't know about you, but this sounds like some Kim Jong-il level exaggerations. I bet the legends say this guy doesn't even poop either. Yeesh. Anyway, when humanity came to being, the nobility watched in secret as humanity rose and flourished until an atomic war nearly wiped all of them out in 1999. 1,000 years after the nuclear holocaust, the nobility emerged to the public and took control for 1,000 years, reigning over the surviving humans and accelerating the progression of science. However, as they rose to power, many of the nobility believed it was their right to inflict terror on humanity. Some going as far as to take human women as their wives, and many feeding on us hairless apes as they pleased. But the Sacred Ancestor's beliefs contradict this. He went far as to respect humanity and did not feed on innocent humans. That is, until around 4000 AD, when the nobility's numbers began to decline due to their constant fighting with humanity. At this point, the sacred ancestor began to conduct experiments with humanity, attempting to create human-vampire hybrids with the best qualities of both species and none of the weaknesses. However, as rumor has it, all of his experiments failed, except for D. Fast forward to 12,090 AD, the time when Vampire Hunter D, the film, takes place. At least one of the films. Since the fall of the nobility 8,000 years before, there are but a handful of nobles still around, many still being hunted down and killed, wreaking havoc on the surrounding towns with no vampire king to stand in their way. The sacred ancestor / king of the vampires, while still wanting to suck on some of that good and all the negative connotations that come with it, still attempted to create a society where vampires and humans can coexist. But the nobility succumbed to their own carnal desires and greed without his guidance, as creatures with a demonic nature often do. And now we have the greater noble that is Count Magnus Lee, the embodiment of these carnal desires, the embodiment of his greed. The Count is obviously very much into Doris. He wants to marry her and do other things to her too. I'm jealous. But then his daughter cries out that he can't soil the noble bloodline with human DNA, to which he says, after 10,000 years of life, the only thing that keeps him from blowing his brains out is plowing the put. Stimulation is a must when you've got eons to fill. That's Count Lee's perspective at least. He's unconcerned with any consequences that may come from his wandering loins because he has yet to meet a force that is stronger than him, at least in quite some time. But what about D? He is the only one with power who understands what happens when you believe everything should serve your greedy hands and HPV-ridden dingle-dangle. He spends his life in perpetual solitude, keeping his urges at bay through isolation and sheer power of will. There's a scene when Doris throws herself at our hybrid hero. He symbolically creams his pants with an intense desire to dig into that neck, and yet he holds back. This is the purgatory of D. Blessed with the looks and powers of a demigod, he lives in a world that crumbled at the feet of desires and unhinged emotions run amok. If you don't believe me, just look at what Count Lee did with the place, and the humans. And so, despite his genetic gifts, D cannot give into lust and bloodlust that could so easily be fulfilled by a man of his stature. In 1999, it was basic human pettiness that lit the world with explosions that poisoned the land with death and radiation. Thousands of years later, vampiric desires keep this decimated world in unending oppression to quell the boredom of an immortal mind who lacks purpose. The only one who can break society free from the gray eons is the one who was blessed with power and cursed with a need to keep his urges from breaking the world. Breaking the world just as the petty apes with existential weapons and Count Magnus Lee have. Cue the final battle. D brings the Count's profoundly long and sensation-filled life to an end, but not before the man who served only himself notices D's uncanny resemblance to the sacred ancestor. With the death of the Count, his castle submerges into the earth and the skies clear to let the sun shine here again. As happens in the fairy tales, the day is saved. D, having lived his own gray eons, ended those thousands of years of misery for this corner of civilization and for all life that once suffered under the Count's rule. But as doesn't happen in fairy tales, D's curse stays with him. Should he stay with the girl who loves him, he may give in to the siren song of pleasure and unleash the side of himself he's fought to keep dormant for millennia. There's also a more tragic reason involved. To ensure he doesn't become the next Magnus Lee, and for the reason I'll get into, D rides off alone into the lush green world he brought back to life, because the potential consequences of his mind unleashed are the same as they ever were. No victory,
can change that. As dramatic and cinematic as all this is merely a day in the life of Dee. Count Lee was only one noble, of which Dee has slain many before. Looking into the books and back lore of his character, it's clear that Dee is several thousands of years old. Clearly, during the climax, it's alluded that he is, perhaps, the son of the sacred ancestor, not merely the result of an experiment, but rather the result of a dick-experiment. I mentioned earlier that the sacred ancestors' experiments to combine humans and vampires happened in about 4000 AD, and this story takes place in about 12,000 AD. Considering Dee is half human, half vampire, that would imply he's about 8,000 years old. Can you imagine being alive for that long? If I may get serious for a moment, would that even be worth it?
Outside this movie, Dee confesses to a character named Iria that he lost something irreplaceable.
Some speculate Dee lost his mother, who was human and therefore would have died, if nothing else of old age, very early in Dee's life. She also may have died to the hands of a vampire. This pivotal event would have happened thousands of years ago, and yet this tragedy still drives this dhampir. Time stacked on time has not erased the profound loss. It has kept him locked in solitude away from loving connections on a millennia-spanning mission to hunt evil. Dee is idealistic, likely in large part to this tragedy that the unfathomable years have not washed away. Vampire Hunter D shows us two contradicting sides of what happens when your immortality leads you to live for millennia. On the one side is the Count Magnus Lee of vampiric nobility, a demonic entity who lives his life based on his carnal desires and without a love for those around him. He's been married, he's lost people seemingly close to him, and even has a dhampir child of his own. Yet his unhindered power and demonic nature of being a vampire has driven him to lust for more power and control above all else. The lessons Magnus has learned through his many millennia lifespan have taught him not of the empathetic emotions that connect to those around him, but rather he honed his powers in order to get what he wants, forever. Until he died. Then we have Dee. He's still a vampire and is pushed towards his desires to bite cuties and drain them of their fluids, but still has the human conscience and willpower to fight those urges, and a human desire to do what is right and learn from his past. Thus, he slays the unnoble nobles. And while Dee's past has put him all alone, not resonating with vampires nor humanity, the human blood running through his veins combined with the memory of early trauma gives him the will to not only right the wrongs of vampires that are overstepping themselves, but also a need to become the best version of himself, one that does not succumb to the id, to his primal lusts. Because that's what separates humanity from the vampires. The conscious mind telling us what to think and to not succumb to every whim we have. But as we've seen, that is much easier said than done. It's a struggle. That's the wellspring of Dee's character, not the super strength, reflexes, stamina, healing powers, everything that makes him a vampire. This internal struggle is Dee, constantly fighting his undead voice with his human one, which is itself imperfect if 1999 is any indication. For eternity, or at least until death, he will be at odds with himself moving forwards in reaction to tragedy. Is Dee's life merely an eternal labor? On the outside, he's handsome and powerful, but his day-to-day existence appears lonely and excruciating. Is fighting yourself for 8,000 years really a life worth living? That's a question I ask you. That's the story of Dee, of Vampire Hunter Dee. The story you never knew. And that's my take on Vampire Hunter D. I'm Grant, and I was serious. That question at the end, please let me know down below what you think. I think it's a super interesting philosophical question, and I'll be reading all the comments. So, let me know. With that, special shout out to our lucky patron of the week, Witchy Muffins. Witchy Muffins, thank you so much for supporting us on Patreon. It means a lot. You're really helping us out, helping us pay the bills, eat food, you know, all the things you do with money. Speaking of which, next week Mike is going to be covering Berserk. Things are going to get demonic, it might even get demonetized, hopefully not.
Don't forget to subscribe and thanks for watching. You are very handsome and pretty.